Today is the final day of the APEC CEO Summit, and Philippine President Duterte's keynote speech he was delivered in Vietnam. He also urged members of the APEC to turn the Asia-Pacific into a comprehensively connected and integrated region. So how can the Philippines achieve that goal? Well, Philippines is holding the rotating presidency of ASEAN. Together with others, it is pushing forward the RCEP talks. Here, I sit down with the Filipino Secretary of Trade and Industry, Ramon Lopez, who offered his thoughts on the common goals that the Philippines and the other ASEAN members share. What kind of platforms are you going to work on?
Okay.
As the trade minister, of course, you're working on these discussions about TPP, RCEP on a constant basis.
Yeah.
But the deadline, that's what we're talking about. Where is the deadline? When is the deadline? How can we reach there?
All right. I guess talking of ASEAN, really the big thing there is the mega trade deal, which is called the RCEP. And the RCEP, you know, this regional integration discussions really take time. But it
was supposed to be the end of this year.
Not really. What we're saying by the end of this year is, I guess, more of substantial conclusion, and I think we're able to reach that by wherein all the participating countries, started by the ASEAN 10 member nations, agreed on what we call the key elements or the framework within which the so-called integration will be based on. So this talks about what % of your tariff lines will be liberalized, meaning to say open it up, bring down to zero the tariff, how many sectors in the services, what will be the rules, economic cooperation, involvement of micro SMEs, things like those, investment agreements. So these things are part of the discussion, and the parameters in the discussion have been agreed on, at least this year. And moving forward, it's really just setting the final numbers. And hopefully in next year in Singapore or the year after, we will be able to come to a conclusion.
Yeah, but you know, even among ASEAN countries yourselves, there are a lot of differences because your economies are at very different development stages.
That's true.
So some wonder whether it is really the differences between the ASEAN countries and the 6 partners, or rather the real differences among the ASEAN economy that is preventing RCEP from really happening.
No, yeah, very good insight. Actually, we recognize the different levels of stages of development, and that is the reason why, to a certain extent, we apply the special and differential treatment, especially for the less developed economies that are part of ASEAN. And that goes, I guess, that principle goes to, as well as here in APEC, when we discuss globalization, I was mentioning about trying to make sure that globalization will be inclusive. And when we say inclusive, what real measures can we look at? And we are talking about making sure that the competencies in the small countries, the companies and micro SMEs in the small economies can really be improved. The competencies, capacity building, sharing of technology, best practices, big brother helping the small brothers. Activities in that regard that will bring education, training, mentoring, etc. It's really empowering those at the base of the pyramid.
Well, it sounds beautiful, but Mr. Minister, I have to say, your economies are also competing with one another.
That's right.
Because many of you are at the manufacturing stage, and you are competing for the market, you are competing for technology, competing for the know-how.
That's true. But, you know, in competition and in globalization, this is the main principle, precisely. In the past, globalization is associated with winners and losers. Now we want to make everyone winners. And it just, you know, just like all the ships in a rising tide, everyone gets to win. But probably one will be a bigger winner than the others. But everyone, you know, in a globalizing world should result in everyone coming out as winners.
So what kind of timeline are we looking at when it comes to RCEP? You know, as journalists, we're always impatient. Yeah. What kind of time frame are we looking at, Mr. Minister?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, I think if we agreed on this, since we agreed already on these key elements, and we have to translate them into the actual final numbers. That might probably be reached at next year. And then looking at the text and the legal scrubbing and all that, it might take another year. So realistically, we're talking of 2019. That's my estimate. If all these things can be wrapped up by next year, then that will be good.
As the rotating presidency of ASEAN countries, what do you think you need to fulfill eventually at the end of the year to make sure the RCEP, at least from your perspective?
We really have to really fine-tune the agreements on these key elements, the framework that everyone will agree to, and at least the ASEAN 10 member countries have agreed to that. And we just have to get the full agreement of the 6 other partner or dialogue countries.
I would assume that's a lot of pressure for you, Mr.
Yes,
Minister.
yes.
Because you have to interact with all of them, trying to find our common grounds as much as possible.
And that is, I guess, that meeting that I'll have to go back to on November 12th. So I'll leave by Friday. Sorry, I think Saturday, so that by Sunday we get really discussing. There will be an ASEAN economic ministers one day.
That's true.
Before the ASEAN leaders. So hopefully we can really wrap up these things in that meeting.
What is the role of China in RCEP from your perspective?
Oh, China plays a big role. It's one of the biggest economies, if not the biggest, when it comes to its participation. The 2 big economies in the 6 dialogue partners of ASEAN would be China and India. And then in China, the good thing, and we're very thankful that with the leadership of President Xi Jinping, he's taking the role of really the one driving for greater globalization. His policy towards globalization has been recognized among many countries nowadays. And we're very grateful for that. And I think China is also one example where it is trying to also to, just like what I was saying earlier, when you talk of globalization to be inclusive, one is you share best practices, you empower the small guys, as well as you open up market access to the small guys. It doesn't stop with just words and rhetorics, but translate it into actual reforms. And market access is a big tool to use if you want really to help the small guys. So, and we see that in China nowadays, especially in the case of the Philippines, for example, given the renewed and stronger relationship of Philippines, led by our President Duterte, as he established also and strengthened the ties with the President Xi Jinping and the leadership of China, we realize a much greater market access for many of the Philippine products, as well as more investments coming into the Philippines and more tourists coming into the Philippines. So we're benefiting from that stronger relationship, and China is very generous in extending the help, even in our infrastructure build-up. They're doing a lot of participation.
What about the TPP?
I think for the TPP, given the exit of the United States, the TPP 11 are also committed to continue the TPP. And it is to our interest, we've registered our interest to look into potential participation of Philippines. As you know, we're not part of TPP. But of course, it will be very important for us, especially if US will be back in the TPP. And it makes it compelling for us to participate. For now, of course, our focus is on RCEP. As you mentioned, it's really a challenge already to complete the RCEP. But as soon as we come to an agreement in RCEP, TPP would be the next big thing.
So you are thinking about it?
Oh, yes.
Coming back?
Yes. We're not part of that yet, but it is in our horizon to really consider joining TPP.
U.S. President Donald Trump, after the APEC leaders meeting, are going to the Philippines for a state visit. What can we expect from the Philippine side when it comes to the outcome?
Of course, the United States is a very big economic partner of ASEAN, one of the big dialogue partners, and definitely his role, meaning President Trump's role and policy direction towards increasing or strengthening the relationship with ASEAN member economies as well as with the other dialogue partners, will be very critical. It depends on how open he will try to make arrangements with these other countries.
Right.
That's very critical. We're excited. We're optimistic that U.S. has a strong sense of commitment ever since on globalization. They are one of the pioneers here. We believe that it is not something they've just dropped off.
How do you feel about the chemistry between President Trump and President Duterte? I mean, both of you are certainly very charismatic leaders.
Yes, we were very fortunate. Even the two leaders have started off very well in terms of their relationship. Through phone calls for now, it will be the first time that they will be meeting here in APEC. And we'll have a dialogue discussion, a bilateral meeting with the U.S. in Manila when President Trump joins ASEAN. And we're very optimistic because the two have gotten along very well since they met over the phone. I think both of them admitted that they are somehow at the same wavelength and the same character. Very strong political willed leaders.
Several balances probably the Philippines together with other countries that are dealing with the United States has to do. One is to balance the White House with the other branches of the government, given their internal debates. And secondly is to balance geopolitically for the Asia-Pacific region. There are different players, India, China, the United States, and some of the others. How do you, from the trade minister's perspective, look at these balances?
They have to play the relationship very well. Again, U.S. moves would be very critical to the future of all these regions and their partners. But they are rational people. They have a rational leader, and the economy is one that will really spell a big difference in the lives of many people they're dealing with. For example, in the Philippines, the way we deal with the U.S., we're fortunate to have a GSP relationship on trade, and they allow, I think, over 3,500 items as part of that. We're also looking at the possible FTA with them, and that is the only way we can really strengthen the relationship.
What about that, the geopolitical thing? Do you, as the trade minister, have to think a lot about that, too?
Of course. It has something to do with, it translates also to the economic relationship, you know. Countries' relationships must be maintained on a positive side.
At the point that when we're talking, the Chinese President Xi Jinping is meeting with President Donald Trump of the United States. From the Philippines' perspective, as a trade minister particularly, what kind of relationship are you expecting?
I think the two leaders respect each other, and the two countries are very critical, the big economies of the world. They'll play a strong leadership role in the world economy, and I think their intention, while they would like to address their respective domestic concerns, is they have a high moral responsibility now of making sure that their relationship will be very sound, that will really would have a ripple effect on, you know, the other countries. So I think they recognize that very important role that the two economies, large economies, would have on the world. So I believe that they are rational leaders that will really think about how it will impact the other countries. So they'll make sure that their relationship will be strong.
There used to be times when territorial disputes and geopolitical reasons that have become the biggest challenge for China and the Philippines.
Okay, yeah.
How are we going to prevent that from happening again? And from the trade perspective, what can be done in order to contribute to the possibility on a better direction? Yeah.
You know, then it boils down to mutual respect for each other's sovereignty. The President has also made it clear that he values with high regard the commitment also of President Xi Jinping. When the two leaders discuss about the South China Sea, the West Philippine Seas, all these discussions. And the more important thing is that both leaders, even our president, is saying that issues that we cannot agree on for now, we put it aside. And we focus on where we can collaborate and cooperate. And that's the wisdom of our president, and as he discusses these things with the President Xi Jinping. The two leaders are very intelligent and really smart in agreeing to focusing on pursuing mutual economic cooperation and development. And that's the beauty that's happening right now. As our leader has mentioned, in due time, in the future, these issues may not be issues at all. That's when I heard him say that. That's
what is your interpretation?
That to me is, I guess, a wisdom from an old person, an experienced person, a wise person. So it's really because even if you talk of friends, two friends, two individuals, sometimes you have issue on a certain thing. But in the future, sometimes that issue is not as big as an issue.
Not relevant
in the
anymore.
future, and not as relevant as before.
But territory issues, I thought, is always relevant.
Of course, and that is where, of course, that I mentioned again. I go back to my first statement: the mutual respect for sovereignty. And how do we address that? How do we discuss that? Let's discuss. I mean, that to me, I guess, is the step moving forward. And to the extent that we can find a solution, good. If not, okay, let's park it and let's talk business.
The Filipino Secretary of Trade and Industry, our exclusive here in Da Nang, Vietnam.